You're looking at 51 birds on a boat in the dark, crossing cold black water toward an island that barely shows up on a map. They are the last of their entire kind on Earth, flightless, nocturnal, a parrot that forgot how to fly and never learned to fear the right things. Everyone watching that crossing thought they were attending a funeral. So did I. Here is the claim I set out to destroy. A bird this broken inbred down to 51 individuals, breeding maybe once every 4 years, with nearly half its eggs hatching into nothing, should be genetically dead already. Extinct on paper, a ghost still flapping its wings. I am a skeptic by reflex, and I assumed the happy ending was a press release, a story New Zealand told itself to sleep better at night. Then I read the genome. In 2021, researchers sequenced the DNA of almost every living Kakapo and several that had been dead for over a century, and what they found tore apart the tidy explanation I had built. I will take you to Codfish Island, to a record buried inside a journal called Cell Genomics, and to a man named Richard Henry who attempted this exact rescue more than 120 years ago and watched it collapse. I will hand you every reasonable explanation for how this creature survived. Then you will watch each one die in front of you. I remember the night this stopped being a casual search for me. I had the 1995 field counts open in one window and a population viability calculator open in the other. I typed in 51 birds, a glacial breeding cycle, and a fertility rate near 60%, and I asked the model the only honest question, do they make it? The model said no. It said they were finished, and for about a week, I believed it, because the math was clean and the math was merciless. The problem is that the bird did not read the math. Let me start where any sensible person would start, with the most boring explanation in the world. You protect an endangered animal, you remove the things killing it, you let it breed, and the numbers climb back up. That is conservation. That is what the donation jars are for. There is nothing mysterious about a population recovering from 51 to more than 250 once you stop the bleeding. I wanted this to be the whole story because it is comfortable, and comfortable explanations let me close the tab and go to bed. But you cannot simply breed a Kakapo back. This is the heaviest parrot alive, a bird that can reach almost 4 kilograms, close to 9 pounds, a green mossy thing that climbs trees and then parachutes clumsily to the ground because its body forgot what wings are for. It does not pair off and nest every spring like a songbird. The males gather on ridgelines, dig themselves shallow bowls in the dirt, and inflate their bodies like living bagpipes, producing a deep booming call you can feel in your chest from kilometers away. They do this for night after night, sometimes for months, and here is the cruel part. They only bother when the rimu trees fruit, a heavy seeding event called a mast, which happens once every 2 to 4 years, sometimes longer. No mast, no breeding. The trees decide whether the species gets a future that year. It gets worse the closer you look. The male contributes nothing after the act itself. He booms, he mates, he wanders back to his ridge, and the female is left to dig the nest, lay the eggs, and raise the chicks entirely alone, leaving them exposed every night while she travels kilometers to feed. And when those eggs are finally laid, roughly 40% of them are infertile. Empty. A whole breeding season, gated behind a tree that fruits once a presidency, and almost half the output is hollow shells. Run that through any population model, and a starting number of 51 is not a recovery story. It is a countdown. So the simple version, protect them and they bounce back, does not survive contact with the biology. A population this slow, this dependent on a tree's mood, this riddled with infertility, sitting at 51 animals, is sitting below what biologists call the minimum viable population. Below that line, a species can enter what they grimly name the extinction vortex, where small numbers cause inbreeding, inbreeding causes weakness, weakness shrinks the numbers further, and the spiral only points one direction. The Kakapo was not just below that line. It had been below it for a very long time, which means protection alone never explained the survival, because protection had been tried before and it had failed in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. That brings me to the next explanation, and this one felt airtight. Forget the breeding rate. The Kakapo never had a fertility problem in the first place. It had a predator problem. For millions of years, New Zealand had almost no land mammals. The Kakapo evolved in a world with no rats, no stoats, no cats, only hunting birds that found prey by sight during the day. So the Kakapo became nocturnal, learned to freeze and rely on its mottled green camouflage, and stopped flying because there was nothing on the ground to flee from. That strategy was perfect for 100,000 years. Then humans arrived with mammals in the hold, and a bird whose entire defense was holding perfectly still became the easiest meal on the islands. Remove the rats and the stoats and the cats, the logic goes, and the bird is fine. Its only flaw was bad luck about who showed up. I believed that completely. Until I found Richard Henry. In 1894, a self-taught conservationist named Richard Henry was appointed caretaker of Resolution Island in Dusky Sound in the deep fjords of New Zealand's southwest. Henry understood decades before anyone official cared that the Kakapo and the kiwi were being wiped out by introduced predators, so he did something extraordinary for his era. Alone, in a rowboat, over several years, he captured and ferried hundreds of birds, by some accounts around 700 across the water to Resolution Island, which he believed was safe because a cold, deep channel separated it from the mainland. He thought the water was a wall. He built with his own hands the first serious predator-free sanctuary in the history of conservation. And around 1900, the stoats arrived. They swam. Stoats are powerful swimmers, and the channel Henry trusted was no barrier at all. Within a few years, the sanctuary he had spent his life building was hollowed out, the birds gone. Henry stayed on, increasingly broken, watching the thing he loved disappear from the island he had chosen to save it. He died in 1929, believing he had failed. So when someone tells you the Kakapo just needed its predators removed, understand that a man already proved, with his own blistered hands and his own shattered heart, that removing predators from one island is not enough. The water you trust will betray you. The thing that swims will find you. That easy story is the villain in this whole investigation, and if you want to go deeper into the hidden mechanisms behind cases like this one, I want to tell you about something I've been working on. I've spent a long time researching the places where official records go quiet, where the comfortable consensus hardens into something that looks less like science and more like a decision, and I wrote it into a series of books: Forbidden Cartography, Beneath the Veil, and Sealed Depths. These aren't books that hand you conclusions. They are built exactly the way this investigation is built. You get the evidence, you get the contradictions, and you decide what holds. If you are the kind of person who stayed with me through Richard Henry's rowboat and the stoats that swam, these books were written for you. You'll find them in the description. But back to the Kakapo and the explanation that turned my skepticism into something closer to anger. And now I have to tell you about the part that turned my skepticism into something closer to anger, because here is where it stops being misfortune and starts being a decision. For most of the time, the Kakapo was sliding toward oblivion. The official posture was not rescue, it was a shrug. The bird was treated as an evolutionary embarrassment, a clumsy relic that had failed to keep up, an animal that was simply naturally going extinct, and the civilized response was to let it go gracefully. Worse than indifference, there was extraction. Across the late 1800s, collectors and museums wanted specimens of this curious flightless parrot before it vanished, and so birds were shot and skinned and shipped to institutions around the world. There are museum drawers, even now, holding thousands of Kakapo skins, a species being carefully cataloged for its own funeral, the trophies preserved while the living animals were left to the rats. The bird was not only being killed by accident, it was being filed away on purpose, written off by the very people with the resources to save it, because the easy story it was always doomed required nothing of anyone. That easy story is the villain in this whole investigation. Not a single conspirator, but a comfortable consensus. The Kakapo is a lost cause, and that consensus very nearly killed it, because for decades it justified doing nothing. Predator removal, when it finally came in earnest in the late 20th century, worked only because a handful of people refused the comfortable story and instead managed every single bird like it was the crown jewels, naming them, tracking them, hand feeding, intervening at every nest. But here is the fact that kept me awake. Even with the predators gone, even with that obsessive care, the deepest threat to the Kakapo was not outside the bird at all. It was inside it, coiled in the DNA of 51 survivors. And no amount of trapping stoats could touch it, so I moved to the explanation that felt the most modern, the most reassuring, the one that fit my faith in human cleverness. Technology saved them. And the technology in the Kakapo program is genuinely astonishing. Every living Kakapo has a name and wears a radio transmitter. Their nests are wired with sensors and infrared cameras. Conservationists developed what they call smart eggs, artificial eggs packed with electronics, slipped under a nesting female to monitor the exact temperature and the precise rhythm of how she turns the real eggs so they can be incubated perfectly elsewhere. During the breeding season of 2019, when so few males were producing viable sperm, the team performed artificial insemination, and to move the semen across the rugged terrain of Wanuahu fast enough to keep it alive, they flew it by drone, a drone carrying parrot sperm over a forest in the dark to fight extinction. That same season produced a record more than 200 eggs laid, the best year anyone had ever recorded. If anything was going to be the whole answer, it was this: human ingenuity brute forcing a bird back from the edge. And I will not pretend the technology did not matter, because it raised hatch rates and saved chicks that would otherwise have died. But technology runs into a wall it cannot climb, and the wall is this: you cannot manufacture genetic diversity. You can incubate an egg flawlessly, but if the genes inside it carry a lethal recessive flaw inherited from both inbred parents, your perfect incubator just produces a dead chick on schedule. That 40% infertility rate, the deformed embryos, the chicks that simply fail, those are the signatures of inbreeding, depression. The textbook fate of any population squeezed through a bottleneck as narrow as 51. The science is brutally clear on this point. A population that small should accumulate harmful mutations faster than it can purge them, building up a hidden debt that comes due as collapse, sometimes generations later. Biologists call it extinction debt, the idea that an animal can already be doomed by its genes while it is still technically alive and breeding. By that logic, the Kakapo was a corpse that hadn't been told yet. Now stop, because here is where you probably assume this has nothing to do with you. A strange green parrot on a freezing island at the bottom of the world, a problem for New Zealand scientists, beautiful but distant, nothing that touches your life. That is exactly the assumption I want to take away from you, and I want to explain why it should bother you specifically. Every species that has ever passed through a genetic bottleneck carries this same invisible ledger. The cheetah went through one and is so genetically uniform that individuals can accept skin grafts from strangers. The Florida panther nearly dissolved into deformity from inbreeding. And our own species, the one reading these words, passed through bottlenecks too. Ancient moments when human numbers crashed to a few thousand and the entire future funneled through a tiny surviving group. The Kakapo is not a curiosity off to the side of biology. It is the cleanest natural experiment on the planet for one terrifying question. When a population gets that small and that inbred, is it automatically a dead species walking or not? And the reason that should keep you up is simple. We decide which species are worth saving, which patients are too far gone for the operating table, which causes are lost, using exactly the rule the Kakapo was about to break. If that rule is wrong, then we have been signing death warrants for animals that could have lived. The Kakapo was supposed to be the proof that some things cannot be saved. Instead, it became the exception that interrogates everything. So I had 4 explanations, and all 4 had failed me. Protection alone could not beat the breeding math. Predator removal had already been tried and drowned with Richard Henry's birds. The comfortable consensus that they were doomed was a self-fulfilling excuse. And technology, for all its drones and smart eggs, could not write diversity into genes that did not have it. Every easy door I tried was locked, so I went looking for the one thing I had been avoiding, the actual genome. expecting it to confirm the worst, that these birds were a genetic disaster being kept alive on life support, and that the recovery was a temporary illusion masking an inevitable end. The study is real, and you can find it published in 2021 in the journal Cell Genomics, led by researcher Nicholas Dussex, with an international team working with the evolutionary geneticist Love Dallane, among others. They did something that had almost never been done for any species. They sequenced the genomes of nearly the entire living Kakapo population, and crucially, they also sequenced museum specimens birds from the old mainland population that had already gone completely extinct, the very skins that collectors had filed away in drawers a century before. For once, those trophies of a funeral became evidence in a resurrection. The scientists could now do something extraordinary. They could compare the genes of the survivors against the genes of the dead and ask what the difference between living and lost actually was. The surviving birds came almost entirely from a single isolated population that had been clinging to Stewart Island in the far south, cut off from the mainland for roughly 10,000 years. Tiny, inbred, trapped. By every assumption I held, by every assumption the textbooks held, this island population should have carried the heaviest genetic load of all 10,000 years of inbreeding, piling up lethal mutations, the most damaged genomes in the species, the worst possible founders for a recovery. That is what I expected the data to show. That is what would have proven my skepticism right and turned this whole story back into the funeral I had assumed it was. The data showed the opposite. The Stewart Island survivors, the inbred remnant that should have been the most broken, carried fewer harmful mutations than the extinct mainland birds. Less genetic load, not more. The population with the lowest diversity had the cleanest genome, and the explanation is the thing that finally ended my resistance, because it inverts everything our instincts tell us about inbreeding. Over those 10,000 years of being small and isolated, natural selection had been quietly performing surgery. In a tiny population, harmful recessive mutations get exposed in the open far more often because related parents pair their flaws together. And when a flaw is exposed, it gets removed, the carrier dies before passing it on. Generation after generation, slowly, brutally, the population had been weeding out its own worst genes. Scientists call it genetic purging. The Kakapo had been cleaning its own genome for 10,000 years. Sit with what that means. The very thing I was certain would kill them, the smallness, the inbreeding, the isolation, the long, slow squeeze was not only their wound, it was also their medicine. The catastrophe was the cure. While I sat with my population calculator declaring them dead, the bird had spent 10 millennia doing the one thing my model never accounted for. It had been purging the poison out of its own bloodline, one painful loss at a time, until the survivors who stepped onto that boat in the dark were not a random scrap of a dying species. They were the filtered, tested, hard-won remainder of the longest natural quality control process I have ever encountered. 51 birds, yes. But 51 birds whose ancestors had already paid the genetic debt that was supposed to bankrupt them. And there is one more thread that pulls it tight. Remember Richard Henry, the man who failed in Dusky Sound? In 1975, on the Fiordland mainland, where everyone assumed the Kakapo was already gone, searchers found a small holdout of birds. One male from that line was captured and, in tribute, named Richard Henry after the broken-hearted caretaker who had tried and lost. That single bird carried genes from the old mainland population, different diversity, a separate branch of the family tree that the Stewart Island survivors did not have. He lived until 2010, and he fathered chicks, threading the last of the mainland's genetics back into the recovering population. The man named Richard Henry failed in his lifetime and died believing it. The bird named Richard Henry completed the rescue more than 100 years later. The failure and the redemption carry the same name, and they are bound together across a century. And I cannot read that without something tightening in my chest. That is the fact that defeated me. Not the drones, not the smart eggs, not the predator fences, though all of those mattered. The thing I could not explain away. The thing printed in a peer-reviewed journal in 2021 and sitting in the sequenced DNA of museum skins and living birds. is that the Kakapo survived because the disaster everyone said would doom. It had instead been refining it for 10,000 years. The bird was not a corpse that hadn't been told yet. It was a survivor that had already done the dying slowly, genetically, over 100 centuries, so that the 51 who crossed that water could live. Here is what was left standing when all my reasonable explanations had fallen. I came to this story certain that the happy ending was a comforting lie, and I left it certain that the comforting lie was my own assumption that small and inbred always means finished. The Kakapo did not get the memo, and the genome proves it, and that should unsettle you more than any ghost story, because it means some of the lost causes we have already given up on were never actually lost. They were just waiting for someone to refuse the easy answer. If you are the kind of person who wants the chill and the receipts both, who refuses to swallow the lazy version of any story just because it lets you stop thinking, then you already know why this one matters. So tell me where my skepticism should have held. Which explanation did you think would survive the protection, the predator removal, the technology before the genome knocked it down? And tell me, honestly, when I plugged 51 birds into that calculator and it said extinction, would you have believed it too? Leave a comment, because this is the rare audience that actually tests the official story instead of nodding along, and I read what you write. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I genuinely want to know how far this strange green parrot signal has traveled. If you want to keep pulling on threads the experts quietly filed away as settled, stay with me, because there is another one I cannot let go. There is a second island and a second population where the official record says the recovery is clean and triumphant, and where one number in the breeding data from the fungal outbreak of 2019 does not sit right with me at all. I am still trying to debunk it. So far, I am failing. Come find out why. That fungal outbreak was called aspergillosis, and in 2019 it tore through the Kakapo during the very season that produced their record-breaking number of eggs. Think about the cruelty of that timing. The best breeding year ever recorded, and at the same moment a respiratory fungus began killing the adults the entire species could not afford to lose. The team flew sick birds to veterinary hospitals on the mainland, ran CT scans on parrots, performed surgeries on animals so rare that each one had a name and a known bloodline. Some lived, some did not. And the reasonable explanation for that outbreak is the one everyone reached for first: bad luck. A wet season, a stressed population packed a little too densely on a small island, a one-off, a tragedy, but a random one. I almost accepted that the way I almost accepted everything else, but when I lined up the timing of the outbreak against the breeding effort, against the density on Wenuahu, against the way every bird now lives on a handful of cramped, predator-free islands because there is nowhere else safe on Earth, the word random stopped fitting. Concentrate the last of a species onto a few tiny scraps of land, push them to breed at maximum intensity, and you may be building the exact conditions for a disease to do in one season what stoats took a century to do. The very strategy that saved the Kakapo may carry its own hidden cost, and I do not yet know how deep that cost runs. That is the thread I am pulling now. So subscribe and stand with the people who would rather chase an uncomfortable number than accept a comfortable headline, because the Kakapo story is not finished, and neither is mine. The genome answered the question I started with. The fungus opened a new one. And I have a feeling the bird is going to surprise me again right when I think I have finally explained it. Here's where this video ends, but the story doesn't. Inside the circle, I take you all the way into the remote island Kakapo recovery and the full genome story, picking up right where I stopped. And in there you can ask me your own question, and a real person in me answers you myself. You won't be alone. So many folks like you are already inside. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime, one click. If a story like this stirred something in you, stay with me here. Subscribe and keep exploring. There's so much more waiting. Every discovery stranger than the last right here on the channel.